Good afternoon and welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope in these difficult and unusual times that you're in a safe place and your loved ones are also safe and healthy. Let me start with a comment I found from a gentleman called Mazzio. COVID is a fast forward button, pulling inevitable changes into the present. 1 month equals 1 year. If a trend was accelerating exponentially, e-com, gaming, remote, the change is jarring, like snapping 2 years off the x-axis. And that took me back to some of the points I was making. COVID-19 has brought us all to an inevitable question. What is it all about? Can it ever return to what it was? As I try and peer through into the future, the one thing I do know is that it's not reverting to what it was. We are turning the page here, and the uncertainty is because we all know collectively that's what we're about to do. The book is in front of us, and the page might turn itself, but turn it will. The question is, what is on the next page? And I cannot answer that. What's certain is that the whole global economy has been hit by an insidious, literally invisible circuit breaker. That is for sure. Notwithstanding the performance of the Dow Jones, which has floated higher on a wave of cheap liquidity. US 2-year yields slowly headed to zero and beyond. Real yields are about to go up during a recession for the first time since 1930, and they are about to go up a lot. Rates have to go negative to partially offset this. This is Raul GMI, and he's called this from way back, actually. I must give him credit. Kudos, Raul. And at a time when it was kind of unthinkable, he was predicting precisely this outcome. And I also know we're about to enter the Great Depression. Home thoughts, there is certainly a fin de siècle, even apocalyptic mood afoot, not least of which that monkey's trying to steal a baby. And also this massive sandstorm engulfs Niger's capital, turning the sky blood red. I like this on a more positive note. Guerel Sahin awaking from R. von Einem. And indeed, it's a new 21st century that we find ourselves in. There is at times a luminous and fairy tale feel to life in quarantine. And as you know, most fairy tales have an oftentimes dark and dangerous and unspoken undercurrent. This was from a while ago when we visited the Tsavo National Park, which is one of my favorites because of its immensity. And this was a sunrise with a herd of elephants at Finch Hattons. Have a watch, it's about 10 minutes. How many elephants can you count? During this recent aerial patrol, one of our pilots spotted more than 600 elephants across the Tsavo Conservation Area. That's from the Sheldrick Trust. During this recent aerial patrol, one of our pilots spotted more than 600 elephants. I remember when I was a little boy counting more than 500 crossing the Mombasa-Nairobi road. And then this late encounter with elephants at Mazima Springs in Tsavo West. It was really an extraordinary situation. We got there at dusk. And as we walked around, suddenly we noticed a whole herd of elephants coming to the springs. It was half light. They're enormous, and it was really very extraordinary and unforgettable. Here is a short video I took of elephants in Tsavo West. You hear them first. And of course, the Lunatic Express passes along and bisects the Tsavo East and Tsavo West. And this is a photo I took of the railway just outside Tsavo East. I came across this explanation of corona and its symptoms from Safi via Bablo Lamu, very unputdownable. And then I came across this fascinating interview with Hendrik Streeck. This is Freddie Sayers of Unheard TV. And in this interview, he seems to be saying, what I found interesting was that super transmissivity happens even closer than the Fluge droplet theory, which is that the Fluge droplet theory is about the transmission of the virus through the air. And in this interview, which is worth listening to, because Hendrik seems to think that there are far more people infected, and therefore the mortality rate is considerably below 1%. And the full interview is there on Unheard. German virologist, COVID-19 is less deadly than feared. I still recall that from the Intelligencer article, the saliva of COVID-19 patients can harbor 500 billion virus particles per teaspoon, and a cough aerosolizes it into a diffuse mist. Political reflection. Zhang Li Fan. China lacks the political wisdom to handle the growing international pressure. This is via William Yang 120. Over the last few weeks, the US began an inquiry into China's handling of the coronavirus outbreak, hoping to hold Beijing responsible for the pandemic that has now killed more than 250,000 people worldwide. In response, China unleashed its wolf warriors, led by its diplomats. As the relationship between China and the US becomes more confrontational, Chinese historian Zhang Lifan thinks that the current situation is the result of both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump's political needs. Zhang Lifan, it's been 101 years since the May 4th movement in China, and the situation in the country now is very different. I think it's hard to make such comparison. I think the situation in China is now more similar to the Boxer uprising at the end of the Qing dynasty. If the Chinese government wants to launch a similar movement now, they might endanger the stability of their own administration. Since the COVID-19 outbreak, a lot of people who originally supported the government have now become disillusioned. They no longer trust the government. I think the reason why the Chinese government is kicking off a patriotic campaign similar to the Boxer uprising is because there is a political need to do so. They want to use patriotism to strengthen people's faith in the government. However, they may not be able to achieve that goal. As I said on the occasion of China turning 70, or the Chinese Communist Party, I said then the world in the 21st century exhibits viral, wildfire, and exponential characteristics and feedback loops which only become obvious in hindsight. Little did I know that it was indeed going to be a virus. I've written before about Xi Jinping and his algorithmic control. And then I was quoting Professor Zhang Run. They now turn to rule over the people by means of what could be dubbed big data totalitarianism and WeChat terror. Returning to the article, Zhang Li Fan, he says, in fact, they might have been increasing their control over society through big data and facial recognition technologies, as well as grid management. All these measures were launched in the name of combating the pandemic. These advanced technologies have brought Beijing's control over civil society to a very sophisticated level. Essentially, everyone in China is under their close surveillance now. An excellent column in WPR Review by Howard French, the comparison of Trump to Mao is a keen-eyed and devastating observation. The coronavirus pandemic and the risks of America's fade-out. For most of the past 3 years, many close observers of American politics shuddered at the thought of what would happen to the United States if it faced a genuine crisis during Donald Trump's presidency. Even many of his elite supporters in the Republican Party, in the media and in business cannot have failed to wonder how a man who struggles to organize his thoughts into clear and linear sentences would be able to marshal the full resources and unified will of the United States to deal with a national emergency. By encouraging protests against state lockdowns by his gun-toting supporters, Trump has taken the embrace of confusion and mismanagement several steps further, approaching levels of deliberate government-fostered disorder not seen since late in the rule of Chinese dictator Mao Zedong, when he incited youth during the Cultural Revolution to attack his own Communist Party elite. Everything under heaven is in utter chaos. The situation is excellent, Mao is said to have uttered. Taking a long view of things, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that this is in part about something much bigger, a decline in America's comprehensive power that has been in the works at least since George W. Bush administration, which is an important point. I think America's fought useless wars from a national interest point of view. They could have controlled outcomes without fighting those wars. Under Barack Obama, the United States sought to, but never fully succeeded in ending American adventurism, and could notably never extract itself from Bush's geopolitical follies. Taking a long view, the current disorder is about something much bigger, a decline in American power that has been in the works at least since the George W. Bush administration. Americans will have to decide what kind of country they want to be once Trump is gone, whatever is left of it. And as I said previously, to watch the daily briefing is to understand that the control machine has a novice, a hubristic Narcissus in charge of the console, and that a non-linear and exponential virus represents the greatest risk to a control machine in point of fact. As new countries emerge as hotspots for the COVID-19 outbreak, the global daily cases are steady and remain above 80,000. But what we're seeing is a spillover from developed markets into emerging and frontier markets. Globally, confirmed cases are now above 3.6 million, that's REMI-GMI. On a 7-day average, daily deaths are around 6,000. Each man's death diminishes me, for I am involved in mankind. Therefore, send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. Voila, Mr. Bill Gates and his vaccine world of algorithmic control. It's been a long game. As I said, there's always more to it. This is what history consists of. It is the sum total of the things they aren't telling us. And now we're learning France's first known case was in December. A patient treated in a hospital near Paris on 27th December for suspected pneumonia actually had the coronavirus, his doctor has said. The patient, Amouresh Hamar, was admitted to hospital on 27th December exhibiting a dry cough, a fever, and trouble breathing symptoms, which would later become known as main indications of coronavirus. This was 4 days before the WHO's China country office was informed of cases of pneumonia of unknown cause being detected in the Chinese city of Wuhan. Dr. Cohen, and this is the important point, pointed out that the patient's wife worked at a supermarket near Charles de Gaulle Airport and could have come into contact with people who had recently arrived from China. The patient's wife said often customers would come directly from the airport still carrying their suitcases, were wondering whether she was asymptomatic. The first human-to-human transmission within Europe had until now thought to have been a German man who was infected by a Chinese colleague who visited Germany between 19th and 22nd January. Roland Cower, professor of veterinary epidemiology and data science at the University of Edinburgh, said that if confirmed, Mr. Hamar's case highlighted the speed at which an infection, starting in a seemingly remote part of the world, could quickly seed infections elsewhere. And indeed, the viral moment has arrived. And as I said, viruses exhibit non-linear and exponential characteristics. The government here, I was speaking about Kenya, needs to get real quick. We need to bring our best talent together. And I think that comment applies globally. Mediocre leadership surrounded by mediocre advisors gets COVIDed. That's why I said a non-linear and exponential virus represents the greatest risk to a control machine. In point of fact, Julius Malema, interestingly enough, in a short video speaking to the same point. And what is thriving is all that ridiculous red culture and nauseating adulation the system heaps on itself via shameless pro-party hacks who chirrup hosannas at every turn. F. William Engdahl, can we trust the WHO? On January 30, Tedros, Director General of the UN World Health Organization, declared a public health emergency of international concern. Tedros curiously criticized other countries who were moving to block flights to China to contain the strange new disease, leading to charges he was unduly defending China. First 3 cases in Wuhan were reported officially on December 27, a full month earlier. The cases were all diagnosed with pneumonia from a novel or new form of SARS coronavirus. On Jan 23 at 2 a.m., 2 days before the start of New Year festivities, Wuhan authorities declared an unprecedented lockdown of the entire city of 11 million as of 10 a.m. that day. By then, hundreds of thousands, if not several million residents had fled in panic to avoid the quarantine. Yet Tedros effusively praised the unprecedented Chinese measures and criticized other countries for placing stigma on China by cutting travel. In an about-face on March 11, Tedros announced for the first time that WHO was calling the novel coronavirus illness, now renamed COVID-19, a global pandemic. At that point, WHO said there were more than 118,000 cases in 114 countries with 4,291 deaths. An earlier WHO fiasco and scandal in 2009 over its declaration of a global pandemic around the swine flu, the WHO decided to drop using the term pandemic. The reason is indicative of the corruption endemic to the WHO. Netherlands Parliament discovered that Professor Alan Oosterhuis of the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, the person at the center of the worldwide swine flu H1N1 influenza pandemic, Key advisor to WHO on influenza, was intimately positioned to personally profit from the billions of euros in vaccines allegedly aimed at H1N1. Many of the other WHO scientific experts who advised Dr. Chan to declare a pandemic were receiving money directly or indirectly from big pharma, including GlaxoSmithKline, Novartis, and other major vaccine makers. The WHO's swine flu pandemic declaration was a fake. The pharma giants took in billions in the process. Current WHO scientific advisory group of experts is riddled with members who receive financially significant funds from either vaccine makers or the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust. Out of 15 scientific members of SAGE, no fewer than 8 had declared an interest by law of potential conflicts. In almost every case, the significant financial funder of these 8 SAGE members included the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Merck, Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, a Gates-funded vaccine group, BMGF, Global Health Scientific Advisory Committee, Pfizer, Novavax, GSK, Novartis, Gilead, and other leading pharma vaccine players. The fact that many of the members of WHO's SAGE have financial ties to the Gates Foundation is highly revealing, even if not surprising. Today, the WHO is primarily financed not by UN member governments, but by what is called a public-private partnership, in which private vaccine companies and the group of Bill Gates-sponsored entities dominate. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation alone gave a whopping $324 million to WHO. Drug makers gave tens of millions of dollars to WHO in 2017. Tedros is the first WHO director not a medical doctor, despite his insistence on using doctor as a title. He is a doctor of philosophy and community health for research investigating the effects of dams on the transmission of malaria in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. He was also Ethiopian Minister for Foreign Affairs until 2016, met Bill Gates when he was Ethiopian Health Minister, and became board chair of the Gates-linked Global Foundation Against HIV, AIDS, TB, and Malaria. ABC report further found that there had also been a surge in internal corruption allegations across the whole of the organization, with the detection of multiple schemes aimed at defrauding large sums of money from the international body. Not very reassuring. As I said in February, WHO is captured and millions of lives have been trifled with. The game is up. Currency markets, euro is at 107.93, dollar index is back above 100. Other big movers, the Brazilian real, 571.55. So currency markets, strong dollar still. China's considering dropping its numerical GDP growth target for 2020. Obviously that number's not going to be very attractive, and therefore we've got to keep an eye on the renminbi, as I've said previously. I quoted Tavi Costa's comments about Chinese GDP previously, where he said, interestingly, this period marked one of the worst decades for this market in history, is comparing China GDP with commodity prices. And I think his correlation is valid. Those who say gold is irrelevant and fiat money serves a social purpose should receive their salary in dinars or pesos, says Daniel Lacal. Gold is around 1685. But remember, it is really the print shop, as Scott Burke 777 said, and that gold is money, everything else is credit, as J.P. Morgan said in 1912. And I do expect a sharp move up beyond 1800 and towards 2000. Crude oil, which had this stunning rebound, last trading at $24.65. Emerging markets, India's numbers are beginning to spike, as we've spoken about for the last 2 days. This is REMI GMI. I like this from Rory Stewart. Social distancing is not always quite sufficient, he said. It's a short video. Russia added 40,000 cases in the past 4 days. Remy again. In South America, there are 235,000 confirmed cases. Remy. Brazilian President Bolsonaro's spokesman has tested positive for COVID-19, his office said, raising further questions about the president's exposure to the virus. Of course, he's previously said Brazilians aren't infected by anything even when they fall into a sewer. And at Unga, he said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. Coming to Africa, this was admittedly 24 hours ago, over 49,000 confirmed COVID-19 cases on the African continent, with more than 16,000 associated recoveries and 1,900 deaths, WHO Afro. As I said in March, we know that the coronavirus is exponential, non-linear and multiplicative. And as Epsilon theory said, real-world exponential growth looks like nothing, 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 then cluster, 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 then boom. Daily cases are trending in Africa, that's from Remy. And we're seeing super spikes. 155 persons die in Yobe state within 6 days over suspected coronavirus symptoms, state governor. New York-based International Rescue Committee warns that many COVID-19 cases are going undetected in Somalia. The situation is on the verge of spiraling out of control. We are seeing widespread community transmission. That's from Thomas Collins. In the DRC, 92 new cases confirmed in just 1 day, Radio Okapi. So we can say that the viral moment has indeed arrived. And the worrying thing is, in a straight contest between coronavirus and bullshit, the coronavirus wins every time. We have not heard from Tanzania for a week. South African All Shares minus 12.7%, dollar rand 18.68, Egyptian pound 15.75, EGX30 minus 26.27%. Nigeria stares into the abyss of a life without oil cash. While headline Brent crude futures have rallied sharply in the past few weeks, rising above $30 a barrel on Tuesday, a glut of Nigerian oil is fetching about $10 less than that. It's now dawned on everyone across the country how severe this threat is, said Andrew Nevin, PricewaterhouseCoopers. There is a possibility that at least for 3 to 5 years there's going to be no revenue flowing to the government from oil. Nigeria's plight is playing out across the world, from Venezuela to Iraq and Iran. Petrostates are grappling with the same bleak future, one where their prized commodity is worth much less than it was, and where private companies often still want their cut. As of late April, the IMF was predicting Nigeria's economy would shrink 3.4% this year. Despite near rock-bottom prices, traders said on Tuesday that about a quarter of Nigeria's crude oil cargoes for loading this month have yet to find buyers. They should normally have been sold by now. At least 6 tankers carrying about 4.5 million barrels of the country's crude have been floating off Gibraltar and nearby Quetta, just inside the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic, since as long ago as the end of March, according to tanker tracking data monitored by Bloomberg. Oil revenues will decline by $26.5 billion this year, down from $54.5 billion in 2019. A period of economic distress could lead to a return of social unrest that dogged the country as recently as 2016. Oil exports bring in more than 90% of foreign exchange earnings. Banks have preferred lending to the lucrative oil sector, with 26% of their loans to firms producing crude. They risk collapsing if the low prices persist. It's going to get worse, Karim said. The problem is a serious one, and it's not something that's going to go away easily. I'm not sure what Nigeria is doing, but for me this is an emergency that the government should be attacking like COVID-19. 5th of March, I was writing in the Africa Report, and I said Nigeria's oil revenue is cratering and a currency devaluation is now predicted and predictable. 9th of December, in an article called Time to Big Up the Dosage of Quaaludes, I was referencing Moody's, who downgraded Nigeria to negative, and we learnt then that foreign investors were propping up the naira to the tune of $16 billion via short-term certificates. And I said, everyone knows how this story ends. When the music stops, everyone will dash for the exit and the currency will collapse, just like it's collapsing in Lusaka as we speak. The drop in worldwide oil consumption in April has been put as high as 35 million barrels a day. We are now entering the twilight zone for a lot of oil producers. And what I do know is this, as I said on the 6th of April, regime implosion is coming to a lot of the oil producers. A return to a hyper-connected 100 million barrels per day world is not going to happen for the foreseeable future. And the price of oil is perfectly correlated to the COVID-19 hard stop. Nigerian All Shares minus 10.05% year-to-date. Ghana Stock Exchange minus 6.84% year-to-date. The Economist, writing about Zambia, Edgar Lungu's largesse. Zambia was already a case study in how not to run an economy. Then along came COVID-19. I feel your pain, said Edgar Lungu in a televised address on April 24. The president of Zambia claimed that COVID-19 had thrown into disarray the country's finances. He mused about whether the government could afford to pay for pensions, civil service salaries, and medicine. Where will the money come from? Nearly half of its tax revenues go towards debt service. Add the public wage bill and there's little left. After Zambia was forgiven some loans, its debt as a share of GDP fell from 104% in 2005 to 25% a year later. Economic growth averaged 7.4% a year from 2001 to 2010. Debt in foreign currencies or owed to foreigners tripled between 2014 and 2018 relative to GDP. These loans may include the underlying asset as collateral. They have led to speculation that any restructuring of Zambian debt to China could involve the handing over of roads, airports, or perhaps even mines. Zambia denies this. Miners say they're owed more than $1 billion in VAT refunds. In May 2019, the government went to court in effect to grab Konkola copper mines, which is mostly owned by Vedanta. Case rumbles on. Price of copper has fallen by 16% this year. Zambia produced more than 800,000 tons in 2019. One miner says he would be astonished if the country produced more than 700,000 in 2020. Mr. Lungu is in deep trouble. As I said on the 14th of October, I was quoting Charlie Robertson, investors have lost faith in government promises to get spending under control, and the government has fallen out with the IMF as well. I called it a pivot moment, and I was quoting Ozymandias, King of Kings, look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing besides remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away. Fantastic photographs, the world through a lens, Madagascar, a cornucopia of beauty. Situated some 250 miles off the coast of Southeast Asia, Madagascar, the fourth largest island on earth, is a world of its own. Sometimes referred to as the eighth continent, Madagascar split from the Indian subcontinent 88 million years ago and the African mainland some 47 million years ago before that. So it's perhaps not surprising that about 90% of its fauna and flora is found nowhere else on Earth. And there's some tremendous photographs, as you can see. I spent several days slowly traveling by boat down the Siribihina River. I learned about Razana ancestor spirits and Fadi taboos, hundreds of which dictate much of local life, from the crew around the campfire in the evenings. We slept under the stars and finally arrived at the limestone mazes of Singi de Beranaha, which aptly means where one cannot walk barefoot. Turning to Kenya, the IMF Executive Board approved a $739 million disbursement to Kenya to address the impact of COVID-19 under the Rapid Credit Facility to support the authorities' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The impact of COVID-19 on the Kenyan economy will be severe. It will act through both global and domestic channels, and downside risks remain large. To ensure that COVID-19 related resources are used for their intended purpose, the authorities plan to conduct independent post-crisis auditing of COVID-19 related expenditures and publish the results. It is a tricky situation. Honourable Moses Karua calls for the government of Kenya to sell its stakes in Safaricom, KCB, Consolidated and Postbanks, all KTDC hotels, Kwal, NOCK, Kenya Ports, Kenya Pipeline, through the NSE to raise 1.5 trillion shillings and avert a debt crisis. That's probably inevitable now. But the government has been very slow on its privatization strategy. There's a cessation of movement in and out of Eastleigh in Nairobi and Old Town in Mombasa effective 7 p.m. yesterday for the next 15 days. This is a photograph looking across at Fort Jesus in Mombasa's Old Town, but I think they are ahead of the curve, but no different to what's going to happen in many other places. Food security farmer from Uasin Gishu, there is hunger lying ahead for Kenya. This is an interview on Citizen Kenya. Floods and locusts refer. Tourism has been the hardest hit sector as it is operating at zero capacity, and with the longer perception risk, also horticulture freight costs are 50 to 60% higher than 3 months ago. I like JIBZ 555, see tourism stopped out, but increasingly see it as a seminal moment. A vaccine, in my opinion, is unlikely for 18 months, and I feel behaviour and consumption of tourism is set to change more permanently. Nairobi All Share is down 10.93% year to date. NSE20 is down 22.39% year to date. Thank you for listening.